Mr. James Maxey. Thank you for coming on to the High Fantasy Podcast. This is the second podcast that we are doing as an author interview in which you can see both the author and the interviewers. And so in this time of viral pandemic, it's great to see people face to face. And so, again, thank you, James, for coming on to share in this nerdy festival of great talk about authorship and fantasy and all that it entails.
All right, you're welcome.
Yeah, no problem. So James Maxey is the author of fantasy series such as Bitterwood and Dragon Apocalypse, as well as superhero fiction like the Nobody Saga and the Lawless series. The 2015 Piedmont Laureate, James has won the Phobos Award, has been nominated for the WSFA Small Press Award, and was reprinted in the year's Best Science Fiction and Fantasy. He is releasing a new installment in the Bitterwood world called DRAGONSGATE DEVILS, and an audiobook version of Bad Wizard, a steampunk retelling of The Wizard of Oz. So, I mean, just off the bat, like, wow. You're interesting, James, already because you're another author who cross-pollinates the different genres. And indeed, science fiction and fantasy these days, there's a lot of overlap. And so I can't wait to discuss that aspect with you. I also see in here that you're a Dungeons and Dragons fan, and yes. I mean, could do another 3 hours or more just talking about that and that whole universe and way of interfacing with fantasy. So again, well, thank you for coming on, and we're honored to have you. Can you tell us more about the Bitterwood world and your upcoming installment, DRAGONSGATE Devils?
Yeah, so until now, there had been 4 books in the Bitterwood series. They're all available in a big, chunky 800-page collection called Bitterwood, the Complete Collection. And now I'm going to have to change the title because it will be an incomplete collection. There's a physical limit on how big the book can get or how small a type can be. And I'm going to blow past that with the new book. But with Bitterwood, it really came from my D&D years. We would sit around after the game and just BS, and spitball ideas. And one of the things we talked about was, wouldn't it be great if there was like a park where you could go and a theme park you go and have like a fantasy adventure and hunt dragons and stuff. And we were talking about doing with the robots, and then it was like, oh, but you could do it with genetic engineering. You could turn a chicken into something like that looks like a dragon by tweaking a few genes. And so I actually wrote a novel built around that premise, set in the modern world where someone is like trying to breed dragons with genetic engineering, and that was a terrible novel. Just completely, it's the second novel I ever wrote, and it was very derivative. It just really wasn't that good. But later, I was thinking, so what happens 1,000 years in the future after these dragons have really established themselves into the ecosystem? And so Bitterwood was the book that came out of that. And it's really written as an epic fantasy, but it's set in our post-apocalyptic future. Anything that appears to be magic has to have a plausible science fiction underpinning to it. The dragons follow earthly laws of biology and physics, so they're not fire breathers. I really kind of got excited about creating a fantasy universe that was our universe.
Yeah, so in other words, set in the real world that we know, but just so extra and blown out of proportion. And yeah.
Well, it's like a mix of like the science fiction elements of storytelling where it's a bit more of a cautionary tale or imagining the future of the human civilization and kind of seeing what could happen feasibly. So like it feasibly could happen that like Jurassic Park might happen, and then on top of Jurassic Park, some idiot decides to put wings on them and breed them into dragons. So,
Well,
yeah.
it is. This is not science fiction. You can Google the term Chickenosaurus, and there are legitimate efforts to crossbreed chickens to have recessive traits come out so that they reveal their dinosaur heritage.
God.
That's a little freaky, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's great.
It is completely real. I am not making this up.
James, did you ever read or watch the films for Jurassic Park?
Yes, I read Jurassic Park. I watched probably the first 3 films. I don't think I've watched any of the reboot stuff in recent years. I haven't heard. I know they were huge. I know they had huge box office, but no one I've actually talked to who's seen them has been like, "Oh, you've got to see this movie. It was so great." They're like, "Yeah, they were okay."
Yeah. That's basically the same premise over and over again.
Well, yeah, but I brought it up. It's like, to me, it was a hugely influential film, and indeed, there's dinosaurs and dragons in your stories simultaneously, and that's just, there's so much to handle because, like you brought up, are they the same thing? Just one has wings and one does not have wings? Are dragons indeed just dinosaurs? Like, when our ancestors came up with the myths for dinosaurs, were they just in awe of a skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus or a Brachiosaurus? So
exactly. Since it's a post-apocalyptic future, the dragons are very intelligent, but civilization has collapsed as they've been rising, and now in the future, they keep finding ruins in museums, and there's reconstructed, T-Rex skeletons and pterodactyls, and they think, gosh, these must be our ancestors. This is proof that the dragons have ruled the world for millions of years. And so they're looking at all this scientific evidence. They're very rational in believing that they are the apex of evolution. Their priesthood is their priests are known as biologians, and basically they have this very Darwinian philosophy of it's right that we've enslaved humans and occasionally eat them for dinner because it's nature. It's this is what we were meant to do. Look at our teeth. Nature wouldn't have evolved. We wouldn't have evolved these teeth if we weren't meant to eat these little mammals. And meanwhile, the humans are pretty much all fundamentalists, who believe that who believe they're separate from nature. One of the in DRAGONSGATE, the new book, I was actually just editing a scene where Bitterwood is talking to a dragon that is referring to a dinosaur skeleton, and he's like, those are just sculptures, that it's just, what you want to believe. If men built museums, they would fill them with sculpted sculptures of giant men to prove how great they are. So he's, complete skeptic that evolution or dinosaurs are real, even though he winds up, having to put a lot of arrows into some dinosaurs.
Right. Keep that balance. Yeah, I was just wondering, as you were explaining this and also the origins of your story, how you were kind of like, what if this situation happened? Like, wouldn't it be fun to kind of explore that? Has that evolved into something where you want to talk about deeper topics about, like, human ideas of being separated from nature and, like, our pseudo-scientific, like, survival of the fittest, like, we are the apex kind of human stuff? Like, are you interested in exploring those deeper topics, or is this all just, like, for fun?
I definitely, if you look for James Maxey quotes on Goodreads, one of the top quotes that comes up is actually the villain, one of the major human villains in Bitterwood is someone who has survived from our current era, and using technology, she's still alive 1,000 years from now. And she's, really glad that human civilization fell apart. She's kind of a Thanos-like figure, and she, felt that, humanity had to fall in order for nature to have a chance to heal itself. And she talks about the end of the human age, when the world was literally falling apart, when the climate was changing and the soil was being stripped of all its nutrients, and the oceans were developing these dead zones. And she says, but it didn't matter. People were oblivious to it because they lived their whole lives inside of an air-conditioned building and saw nature in carefully tended parks. And they were immune to the price that they were paying. And so I feel kind of bad that it winds up being the villain who's uttering these words, but she's got some other personality flaws aside from just strict environmentalism. But it's true. I hope I like for my books to be thought-provoking. I very seldom try to have characters that are pure good or pure evil. If the bad guys, I try to go on my way to make sure you understand their motives, understand how they see themselves as the hero, and sometimes I pull it off. Leave it to others to judge.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of idea of leaving the readers to judge who they align with the most is quite an interesting sort of modern take on storytelling, I think, because storytelling in general has been quite moralistic, especially in Origin. So it's quite cool to see Spec especially just kind of take that on and being like, but what if the villain actually pulls at your heartstrings more than the so-called protagonist who has a sort of righteous air to him or whatever it is that makes it quite unappealing in a way.
One of the things about the Bitterwood series and about the Dragonsgate novels that I'm now writing is half the characters are dragons. They have moral codes, they have relationships, they have hopes, and they're not monolithic. The dragons argue with each other. There's this ongoing debate between two of the dragons in Dragonsgate about whether humans should be regarded as equals to dragons, or whether they're just not capable of taking care of themselves, and that if we weren't imposing order on them, they would revert to savagery and be wild animals. Our taming them is the best thing that's ever happened to them. And I try not to make it just dragons bad, humans good. One of the leaders of the human rebels fighting the dragons in the original collection is a very Old Testament style prophet of the Lord named Ragnar, who's just join or die. He's got no middle ground, and he's passion. He's everything that you need in a leader, to really organize people in the fight against these dragons. He can inspire people. He's got charisma, and yet there's also, in his simplistic worldview, there's people that he's allied himself with. It's like, is life with him in charge actually going to be better for us than life with the dragons,
Right.
So.
Do you think that playing D&D has kind of helped you foster this idea of like interspecies balance? And because in D&D you can play different races and they're all kind of equal, but they all have like very different sort of origins and views, and the moral alignments that you can be in can be quite different depending on who you are. Do you think that played into your storytelling in that
No
way?
question. Yes, 100%. I was the DM in the majority of games I took part in, and and so I'm essentially playing the monster. And in my early games, it's like the monsters have zero life except that they're waiting around in a room until the adventurers kick in the door and start stabbing them, and then they fall down and they've got some gold hidden in there, hidden under their bedding. And that was all the development that my early game monsters had. But as I kept going along and playing more and more, I would, the dragons, the monsters started developing their own agendas, and I would, put in an orc or a goblin or king or something who wasn't just there to be stabbed. He had something that he wanted, and anytime I would start thinking about, well, what would motivate him, once I got past that, oh, well, he's just a greedy bastard, it started being like, oh, well, humans want this too, maybe from their point of view, it's not so wrong. And so, I really liked putting my characters into tricky moral situations. So early on when I was playing these games, the standard pattern had been, oh, we're just going to stab you and be done with you. And so, I was like, okay. So they burst in the room, and all the goblins surrender and, are pleading for mercy. And it's like, all right, how do you move forward with the quest now? You're here to clean out the dungeon. What are we going to do? Now we've got a dozen, goblins, there's not enough rope to tie them up, and if we did tie them up, what's the ethics here of killing a foe that isn't trying to kill us? We're not in any kind of self-defense. And so, I really did like getting into the morality of you've probably, I don't know if you've heard the phrase murder hobos, but a lot of D&D adventurers are basically just hobos with just the clothes on their back, wandering around, murdering people and taking their stuff.
Yeah.
If D&D were reflected, if the real world were anyway reflected in the D&D, if you were sitting around watching TV with your best friend and he suddenly had a heart attack and died, you wouldn't call the hospital. You would check his wallet and start dividing up. Who wants his shoes?
Steal his shoes.
Yeah. Take a short rest.
Yeah.
Take a short rest. And then his body's already decaying, and you go, oh, okay, time to call.
Yeah, before it's overturned.
Dragons. How long have we been playing our campaign anyway? Like it's been probably a year. Yeah. And it's just so cool how, like, when you're removed from the digital stimulus and the video game, medium, how much more your imagination actually plays a part of the gameplay and the storytelling and whatnot. And we have a really good DM as well who enjoys punishing the crap out of us with monsters.
Like the smallest thing, yeah.
The thing that really captivated me when you were talking about that was, and it's come up on our podcast at least a couple times, which is the idea that like fantasy is kind of like a way to simulate different versions of reality, as well as specifically with games, how it's almost more fun at times to play the bad guy or to play like a character whose moral alignment is very in opposition to yours in the real world. Just because I find it's harder, and it's also more interesting because then you learn more about like yourself and the friends that you're playing with, etc. And like for me, I'm playing a Dragonborn bard, and it's a combination that I really was not like too keen on, because I was like, a Dragonborn, like why do I want to play that? I want to play a different race, but not so like cartoony or kiddish even, because associating dragons with dinosaurs and then dinosaurs with being a kid, psychologically it's just interesting. And then a bard, because I totally don't like classes that are very ambiguous in terms of what their role is and are kind of the jack of all trades, master of none. So I decided I'm going to go with a race and class combination that is not what I hope for. And you went for
gnome sorceress.
Yes, so a pint-sized fireball wielding.
Yeah. Gets drunk too often.
Yeah. I will say that probably the most valuable lesson I got out of 20 plus years of doing weekly D&D games is I learned that the character's agenda is not always going to be my agenda.
Right.
I would go into these games with a plot in mind, and it depended on the characters making certain choices and doing certain things. And I eventually had to found out it was far more fun to adapt when they went off the rails and made decisions I never saw coming, and put me into situations where I was just like, well, I've got these 9 other, rooms of the dungeon drawn out, but they're not going there now. They're going to go elsewhere because, this character has decided, has made a choice I did not anticipate. And that is still an approach that I try to bring to every book I write. You've probably heard the term pantser versus outliner, where some people really outline every scene of their book and other people just make it up as they go along. And I'm definitely a pantser in that I create my characters, I give them a goal, and then what they do to get to that goal, I just trust them, let them do what they want, and adapt to it. And I can still think back to, specific times in D&D games where all my carefully laid plans were just completely upended by, an action I never saw coming, and worked out so much better than anything I could have ever thought of in advance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like making good characters that you have really sunk the time into. It's like insurance for when you come up with like a narrative that isn't so hot. You go, well, okay, the story part isn't so good, but the characters are solid. So I can just I can change the content, a little bit. And that's cool.
Yeah. And I really think that, especially if you're a writer or if you do the collaborative storytelling of D&D, that you realize the characters in your head or like that you're playing with have their own sort of lives and consciousnesses even. And they can just kind of go their own way because they take some sort of subconscious part of your own brain that you don't really understand. And you just kind of have to go with it sometimes. And I think even beyond characters as well, what you said earlier about the environment that D&D puts you in is also really interesting. So recently I was part of a D&D group that was more based in indigenous storytelling rather than the traditional like sword and sorcery fantasy of D&D, because there was a person, I believe he was Cherokee, who created a game of D&D or a version of it where it's not always about killing people and then looting, because that's kind of like it's the very like traditional trope of conquering that fantasy is pretty much based off, and it's based off of colonialism and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah, it was a really interesting version of the game where it was a lot more based on character development and developing your character and seeing what past and histories that they have and how they intermingle with your other characters, and a bit more about the relationships of the different characters and NPCs, so to speak, in that world and how they connect to your character. And I thought it was quite revolutionary and inspiring that there can be these fantasy stories that are not necessarily based off of, oh, I need to like make as much money and glory and all these kind of things that, you know, sometimes might not align with who you are as a person, but you still love fantasy and love everything about the genre still. So yeah, it's pretty awesome. Have you ever delved into other types of D&D, like in terms of like the stories that you tell? Like what kind of stories do you usually go for?
Or are you asking about like variant games like Traveler, which was like a space thing, or are you just looking at alternative plot lines? There was a there was a romance plot that once developed in one of my games that I had not anticipated. There had been a character who was a wizard, and he had 118, and he didn't put it as intelligence. He put it in his charisma, and I'd never seen anybody but a paladin ever, you know, voluntarily put an 18 in their charisma. But it turned out, you know, and today, this was almost 20 years ago. Today it might be considered a little sexist, but his plan was to seduce every female character he encountered, you know, and you know, he was just, you know, was playing this lady killer, and you know, I'm sure that he had some motives, you know, for doing this, but it was also, as a DM, I was really having to adapt to someone whose goal was not, you know, theft, you know, and it wasn't even, you know, necessarily, it wasn't like the slimy conquest. He just really just did not, you know, he felt like he was worthy of love, and he gave love, and that was just sort of who he was. And the fact he could also cast fireballs was, you know, just another part of, just another aspect, you know. But, you know, his goal in going out in the world was, you know, looking for romance in the romantic sense. And yeah, so, yeah, that definitely caused me to do some adaptation.
For sure.
Yeah, well, and that's what I like about fantasy storytelling as well, and especially D&D, is it so often becomes like silly and about, you know, the sense of humor that the players have and the DM have, and that bleeds into the attempts that we do to really do honest, empathetic, channeling this character, right, and telling, oh yeah, like I'm a Dragonborn, I'm a bard, and I have this past, and I have all this lore, and I believe in different gods, etc. And then, yeah, like these weird little quirks, like someone will try to bring it in. We have one character who's playing, one of our friends who's in the group, and is playing, I think it's a Triton?
Yeah, Triton.
Yeah, it's the underwater, yeah. And decided that this character would have a southern U.S. accent at the same time, and it's like, why? It's totally, it's demolishing our attempts to build like a cohesive in character narrative, if that makes sense. You know, there's still a story, and that'll go on regardless. But
everyone underwater just has a South American accent.
Yeah, for some reason. And then there's all these jokes about drowning but out of water.
Yeah.
And just
water puns.
Yeah, water puns. So those are.
On the other hand, you know, it's, you know, whenever you hit situations like that, it's a chance to stop and kind of question your own expectations of, well, why would I assume that all fantasy characters are speaking in this medieval British, flair and using, a specific, Shakespearean vocabulary. I got very lucky, and with my Dragon Apocalypse novels, I had a narrator named Jay Curry, who is British, and the second I heard my fantasy novels being read in this British voice, I was like, this is right. This is it. This is the perfect voice for this. But when I'm writing the book, I'm writing in a Southern American accent, because that's my accent.
Right.
I see it all the time. I'll be reading my own work out loud to proof check it, and be thinking, that's a very Southern way of putting that, and I'll need to tweak it, perhaps to make it a little less, more universal.
For sure.
Yeah, that's cool. And like I admire that you're confident about that, James. We also recently spoke with an author from East Texas, and David was really, really funny, and he said, unabashedly that, my characters, the East Texas comes out in them, even though I know that, the readers are not they're going to be from all over, and there's different demographics that are going to pick up the book and stuff, but you have to kind of own that your own voice is your own voice, and, don't be too harsh or critical of your own, but where you come from and stuff.
Yeah. Going back into your writing, I'm really curious to know what your favorite element of writing is. As a DM, I'm sure world building is a big part of your life. Does that translate into your novel writing as well? Do you like world building or character development or dialogue, action? Or do you even separate it like that?
Yeah, it's hard. It's very difficult to separate. I am, in general, not as heavy of a world builder. I don't sit around and draw out maps and think about who the king is and et cetera. A lot of the big picture stuff I just let arise organically from the book. Usually I'm starting with the character and working out of their backstory, and their backstories, cause me to ask questions, and that starts putting together the larger world for me. But so I would say mostly I'm character driven, but it's you're speaking to me as I am on chapter 28 of a 30-chapter novel, on the 7th draft, where I'm currently having my computer read it out loud to me, and I'm sitting there listening for every word it's being read in this monotone voice. But the thing is, I will notice weird phrasing. I'll notice an extra word. I'll be like, why do I need 5 words to say this when you could say it in 2 words? And so at this point, when you ask me what my favorite part of writing is, I can only say being done.
Yeah, for sure. I think writing is definitely one of those things where it's easier to tell people what you hate about it or strongly dislike rather than what you actually like about it.
So the part that I like, so this is the genuine best part of being a writer, is I daydream. I'm still allowed to just sit around and make up crazy shit in my head, and then I just type it down, and for some reason people give me money and write online that I'm a genius, and it's a pretty good scam, I really, just like I keep feeling like, gosh, I can't believe that this works, that I get to sit around and think about what it would be like if dragon was fighting a dinosaur and there's a time traveler and an artificial intelligence, who's been living on the moon for 1,000 years. And I just start mixing this all up, and it becomes so completely crazy. And then people read it, and they like it. And it's just like, gosh, that seems unethical. It seems a little too easy.
Well, you hit the keyword there of Daydream. We were going to bring up your upcoming nonfiction book, Daydream Type Profit Repeat, which is basically a writer's guide of, there you go, of how to go about this seemingly very complicated and daunting process of having a writing career, and you're breaking it down for people.
Exactly. This really. I do a lot of writing panels at science fiction conventions, and a panel that I have probably done some variation of 50 times by now is the panel of how do you make a living as a writer, and so I was on a panel, and there were like 5 authors speaking ahead of me, and one by one they all were like, oh, it's so hard, your publishers are going to break your contracts, and your agent's going to quit, and you're going to get stuck with a terrible cover on your book. And by the time it got to me, I could just look out in the room and just see, how all the energy had just gone from this room of people who want to be writers. And I was like, I don't know what they're complaining about. I daydream, I type, and people give me money. And it really doesn't need to be, it is more complicated than that, and yet if you don't lose sight of the fundamental simplicity of what you're doing and the fact that you still, the skill that you developed when you were 3 years old of how to make up stories and tell lies and try to persuade other people that the reality that they are perceiving is not necessarily the reality as it really is. Right. I didn't eat those cookies. I don't know. The dog ate them so violently the crumbs got onto my face. The fact that that is something that you can continue to develop and get, win awards for. And it's a very strange world. There are people who are heart surgeons, that obviously get paid a lot more money and get a lot of acclaim, but still it's interesting that, they get all that, they get a certain amount of respect. But I don't know, maybe they do, but I don't know if they get the fan mail.
Yeah.
Right.
So I like it. I mean, that's just really, kind of fun.
Yeah.
I'm sure, this is probably true for a lot of people, that in this time during a pandemic, if you're a medical professional, you're probably hearing for the first time really ever that people appreciate what you do.
Yeah.
And, I've got people in my family who are healthcare workers, and it definitely hit me wow, these people put their lives on the line and they don't have the renown that a famous author would.
Well, it really brings to heart, what is creating emotion for people. And usually it is art, writing and music. So those are the people who receive that heartfelt, emotional connection, sort of emails or fan mail.
Yeah,
but now the emotional connection is through survival for a lot of people, and people are appreciating things more. I was actually just reading this very heart-wrenching Twitter thread about this father who had a daughter who loved pen paling, and so kept pen paling people. And then one day she sent a pen pal to the mailman who delivered her mail. And it's during COVID that this happened, and he was so touched that he told his boss, and then the boss told a bunch of other people, and then this little girl started getting fan mail from all over the country telling her, like, thank you for appreciating our work now, and all these kinds of things. So, I mean, that it's such a, like, inspirational thing that, you know, people keep doing work and everyone wants to be recognized, and especially writers. Like, there's so many writers who, you know, do their craft and hope to that point someday of receiving that fan mail. And it's amazing that you are experiencing that right now. So what do you think is the advice that you've seen has really translated well for other people and has actually, like, given them the push that they need to start their careers or get over an obstacle that or self-doubt that they've been facing? What is that piece of advice?
The one piece of advice that I frequently give is that if you want to write a good novel, you have to give yourself permission to write a bad novel. You're never going to write a perfect novel on the first try. You know, I'm sure that sometime in the history of literature, an author sat down, started typing, and wrote the book perfectly on the first draft. But for the most part, you have to write this terrible, disjointed, illogical, clunky novel, you know, clunky collection of words. Sometimes it even defies being called a novel. And then you get to rewrite. And rewriting is where you have superpowers, because now you can time travel. You can keep going back to the same moments again and again and tweaking them until you get the outcome that you needed and the results you needed. You have precognition, characters that, you know, were opaque to you the first time through and you had no idea what they're thinking. You know, now you know their thoughts. Now you understand their motives and their goals. You know, it's these, you know, these superior powers that you have in the later drafts, you know, are, you know, make the whole writing thing so much easier. But to get those powers, you first have to be bitten by that radioactive manuscript. And that manuscript just requires you to sit there and slog it out. and produce some crap. And then, you know, you don't have to show it to people. You know, your favorite musician who's written the best song ever, you go see him in concert and he's wonderful. You know, you would not be as impressed if you were watching him, you know, 10 years ago plunking out, you know, chords on a guitar, trying to learn to play, just noodling around. Right. And, you know, writing, you know, really, you know, silly lyrics. You know, I don't know if it's true or not, but the urban legend is that Paul McCartney, who was writing Yesterday, didn't have the words. He was just singing scrambled eggs you know, to fill it in. And so, you know, people don't see the first drafts except for you. And you look at that first draft, you think, oh, this is terrible. And it's just the rest of the world's first drafts are hidden from you. You know, you're looking at an end product that is the result of countless hours of work. Mm-hmm. And once you understand that and understand that you are part of this process and that there's really nothing standing between you and a great book other than an immense amount of work and time. I might have had a concluding thought there, but that was my first draft. I'll go back and say it all.
If only talking had a revisionary element.
Oh my god, man! I to this day, I mean, even in this interview, I wish that we had like a rewind button where I can just go, no. I mean, we call that editing now.
Yeah.
But I wish it was, you know.
Yeah, no. I've had, you know, I've had some like interviews early on for like, you know, local radio stations, and you know, we'll talk for like 45 minutes, and you know, it turns into like a 3-minute piece, you know.
Yeah. It's a little bit like, okay, I understand that you have this very short segment that you can put me in, but like, was that all I said that was useful?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Where do we want to go from here? Like, there's just so much I want to, I want to get more into.
I do want to talk about, James, just before we wrap up with other stuff, about your superhero fiction.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, how does that, so like everyone knows there's comic books and, you know, the recent Marvel and DC movies as well that have those superhero characters. What made you decide that you wanted to write novels about superheroes, and how does that translate in the games?
So these days, novels about superheroes really are not that uncommon. But I wrote my first superhero novel back in the year 2000. And at the time, if you walked into a bookstore, you might find a Batman or a Spider-Man novel, but there just was not such a thing as an independent superhero novel. And I had this plan to write this hard science fiction novel about colonizing Venus. And when it came time to where it's like, well, today is the day I'm going to start writing my novel, I started writing out this scene about an invisible man telling jokes in an empty comedy club, you know, standing in front of a microphone stand with no mic on it. And I really didn't quite know exactly where I was going or why I was going there. But I just kept developing, you know, these comic booky ideas, and it turned out to be the story I wanted to write. And so it is probably the first novel that I ever wrote that I wrote in a condition of utter despair, of thinking, I'm not going to publish this. There's, you know, independent publishing was not really an option back then. Mainstream publishers weren't going to want to touch it. And, you know, a lot of it just came down to, you know, if it turns out that I'm the only person that ever reads this book, if I want to read it, I've got to write it. So let's just do it. You know, this is part of being an artist. You know, you can't just sit around thinking, gosh, is this project going to make me money? Sometimes you've got to write a story just because you have it in you. And, you know, my superhero stuff has never sold as well as Dragon stuff. But, you know, I grew up reading comic books. You know, the genre blending that you're talking about, you know, in literature, in written literature, for a long time, there were fairly hard barriers. You know, you were writing about spaceships or you're writing about dragons, but they weren't going to be in the same stories. Whereas if you were growing up, you know, from even in the 1940s, and you're reading Justice Society of America, you know, they were putting together teams where one guy is a science-based hero and the other guy is a supernatural hero, and then there's another guy who's just an angry short dude in tights who likes beating up people. And this mashup of unlikely characters and concepts, you know, and just, you know, like, you know, we're not going to worry about an overarching logic here. You know, what is coming out of us is what's going onto the page, and, you know, the reader's just going to have to deal with it. And I've always admired that golden age and silver age storytelling where they will just throw the most insane ideas at you, and, you know, they don't stop to explain it or to justify it. It's like, okay, yes, there's a gun, and if you get hit by it, it turns you into a baby. We're fine. We'll just work with that, and you tell your story, and I'm going to have fun with it. And at the end, you know, Clark's going to trick Lois into thinking that he's not Superman again. I'm fine with that. And so I really want to write those sort of books. And so I'm up to 6 now. I was working on a 7th one called Nobody Nowhere that is got one of the few books I've ever gotten really far into and abandoned. I will probably one day go back to it, but I felt like I hit a point where I felt like I was repeating myself, and so I really wanted to stop. I mean, I was finding myself, basically using exactly the same villain and fight scenarios I had used in previous books, and I was like, this is something I need to fix. That is, by the way, once you get up to writing, when you're writing your first 3 or 4 books, it's easy not to repeat yourself. I'm writing my 22nd book, I think, maybe 23rd, and trying to find obstacles and confrontations for characters that I have not yet used before and putting them into something fresh is increasingly a challenge. And you can get past some of it with a little humor. There's an ongoing joke about trapdoors in the book, because I realized, gosh, my plot involves 3 people falling into a trapdoor over the course of 150,000 words. That seems like 2 times too many. And yet, so I wound up, I actually still retain 2 of the trapdoors, but have some humorous responses to the paranoia now about every floor having a trapdoor in it.
Right.
Later in the book.
Like you're being self-aware that readers are probably picking up on the trapdoor phenomena in your book.
The trapdoor phenomena, the thing that I'm noticing as I'm into this, and I really don't know that I'm dedicated enough to fix it, is there's probably a dozen times over the course of the book where people shield their eyes from the sun. They're outdoors. It's in a world without sunglasses. It seems like a very natural gesture to do, and so I'm probably about chapter 25. I was just like, gosh, I feel like I've written this line before, and so I start looking for the phrases, and it's like, do I need to go back? Are readers even going to notice it? Is it that unusual? So yeah, trying to avoid stuff like that. I will also say, as someone who writes a lot of violence, the English language is horribly deficient in synonyms for blood.
Yeah.
Basically have ichor and gore. And then if you were writing in a more modern setting, you could have hemoglobin or, something more scientific. But in a fantasy setting, it's basically, blood and gore. And gore, you need a ton of it before it's gore.
Need a bit of flesh in there too for gore.
So I really, a lot of this current draft has been like, how many times can I say blood in the course of a single page, and how can I start getting that down to a more manageable level?
Yeah, I guess as a writer, it is like about catching what phrases you use and what sort of situations you always put your characters in. So it's always cool to kind of like catalog those, because as readers, I think we also do that. Like I write young adult fantasy, sci-fi, and so like it's like a common trope now to laugh at books that has the character let out a breath that she didn't know she was holding. Like that's in every young adult fantasy book ever, and I am striving to never do that, because I don't think anyone ever does that. Even like they're holding a breath that they don't know that they've been holding. Like you would die, you would collapse.
You can just say breathtaking, right?
Yeah.
You can just use the word breathtaking.
Or just gasp or something. But anyway, it's interesting, especially as you mentioned, English is quite deficient in conveying different emotions and phenomena out there. So the levels that we go to describe some of these things sometimes is It's an experiment, and it can be hit or miss for sure.
Yeah. The point that you made, James, about, if you have a sentence that's 5 words long and it sounds like it is 3 words too long, then you should correct it. That's pretty big advice. And it's like pretty simple too.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to master that, like the art of concision, and it's I think the thing that's tough, especially for a lot of younger or newer authors, what have you, is they don't really know when it is too much description and too much info, and when you're not allowing the reader to use their imagination versus you're concealing way too much and it's obscure and you don't really know what's going on. So that's something that I'm trying to work on. Is like, do you have a specific tactic for doing that aside from having the computer repeat things to you in a very monotone way, which is a brilliant idea. I never quite thought about that.
So yeah, so every book is going to be different. So when I write my superhero novels, the prose is actually sort of sparse. I don't really need to do a lot of scene setting. If you're in a living room, I don't really need to describe the living room. The character, the villain's robbing a bank. You know what a bank looks like. I don't really need to stop and give a long-term description. Whereas in fantasy settings, especially in Bitterwood, where in your post-apocalyptic landscape, again and again, I've got to describe the character among the ruins of something from the modern age without being able to use, like if they're fighting beneath an interstate, columns of an interstate overpass. I can't just say they're at an interstate overpass. I've got to take my time and deliberately and carefully describe these in a way that the modern reader is going to know where they're at, but using the vocabulary of people who don't have these modern terms. And so with my fantasy novels, the prose can be a bit more lush. I can spend, 100 words, setting a scene and building a scene, it's a different reading experience. So a lot of it's just being aware of your audience. Read a lot is the other thing. You'll find that there are authors who, whose prose that you admire, and you stop and you start breaking it down and how are they doing this? How much time are they devoting to describing things? How efficient are they at painting a scene? And then, you start imitating them. That's, it's a perfectly valid thing to do. Obviously you can't plagiarize, but, there's definitely things you can learn from your favorite authors. There's Piers Anthony was an author that I read a lot of, and he wrote this very playful fantasy, and his prose was not terribly elaborate. It's very, very, there's a lot of puns in it. Basically, it's like move to the next joke. And he was writing essentially where every scene, is a long form joke building to a punchline. And so I stole a lot of that timing and pacing, and just learned to put in, just as much as I need. The downside of once you start developing that skill of breaking apart other readers' work that you like and finding out, how their pacing works and how their vocabulary specifically is, it's like you lose some of that ability to just be a fan and just appreciate it and love the experience. I imagine it's the same way that if you were a movie editor, you probably watch a film and it's like, oh, look at that cut, I wonder, I bet they left this on the cutting room floor, and oh, there's a coat in the background in that shot and it's not there in that shot. And so you sort of, to become good at something, to really master at something, at creating content, you sort of lose the ability to naturally consume the content. And so I actually find that now I most often, gravitate to nonfiction books for my casual reading, and I also read a lot of classic literature, and as far as contemporary work written by my peers, I sort of have gotten skittish about jumping into it because I know that I'm not going to just be able to turn off my brain and read it the way that I could have read it when I was 18 years old. Instead, I'm going to just be sitting there picking apart every line and every character choice and wondering, why did they name this character this name? This name is wrong for this character. I'll get very strong opinions about the stupidest things. And so that is sort of one of the prices that you'll pay, for going into this. You'll pass this veil where you stop being the consumer and start being the producer, and the world is forever a little different.
For sure.
Yeah, that's pretty profound too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that a little bit because I'm doing an English master's right now, so our whole thing is just dissecting books, but in a very more thematic way rather than technical. So reading sometimes can just be a chore because I'm like, oh, this is the symbolism and the themes that are connecting with the motif and the metaphor.
Lots of eye rolling.
Or even movies now, because literature class is extended to movies as well now, and art and all these things. But yeah, it's definitely something that you have to, if you're going to take on that burden of being a writer in that way of analyzing books, you have to figure out how to either turn it off or figure out if you can love other genres as much and read from there.
Have you ever heard of a book called Towing Jehovah? I think it's by James Morrow.
The title kind of rings a bell, yeah. Is this a recent one or classic?
It's probably close to 20 years old at this point. But I took a writing class where James Morrow was one of the guest writers. And this would have been back in like 1999. And his workshop was on how to use the false goal in order to advance your plot. Because one of the problems of plotting is that your characters have to be striving towards a goal, and it's natural that they have a plan for how to reach that goal and overcome the obstacles that are going to be in their way. And yet, if you wrote a story where they had a goal, they had a plan, and they went through it, and they got what they wanted, it would be a very boring story. There'd be, nothing that really you could connect with. You saw it coming all along. So you can also just start randomly throwing in stuff, but then that also turns out to just, it will start to like, well, this is all just random. The writer's just making this up. So the key of advancing any plot is this false goal. The characters are trying to find this something, they're working towards it, thinking it's going to solve their problems, and you as the writer knows the whole time it's not going to solve their problems. And so, having written a Wizard of Oz novel, in the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy thinks that first, that once she finds the wizard, all she needs to do is find the wizard, and that's going to help her get home. Then she thinks, oh, once I kill the witch, the wizard's going to help me home. And so you're getting these different series of goals that aren't actually going to get her what she wants. And once that was revealed to me, for 20 years, I've never been able to watch a movie or a TV show without going, oh, there's the false goal. It's one of these things where it's like, it's great that I know this and I know how to use it in my books. But I haven't been surprised by a plot twist, and it's so long.
Yeah, I do recall maybe a couple of years ago when I had that distinct moment when plot twists did not surprise me that much anymore, and I felt like, oh, there's kind of a magic that's being lost there. But at the same time, there's so much more, because you go, why did the author or the creators of this show, book, whatever, game, put that there, and then what does it mean? And I think in a way, like when you do, like you said, James, have a little bit of that, like you journey behind the curtain a bit, you kind of see that there's even more behind it, and that in itself is pretty interesting too, right? Is like the essence behind
the creative side of
yeah.
That. Yeah, that's very true. You always lose something and gain something in return.
I'm going to hold up my Wizard of Oz book since I just mentioned it.
Yeah,
Bad Wizard, and it is just released on Audible, narrated by Jason Burkhead. Great narrator. He's already narrated like 24 books or more. And so I felt very lucky to get him. He was just the perfect voice for the project. I mentioned working with Jake Curry for the Dragon Apocalypse. Jake is now also recording my Bitterwood novels, but because he has that very British voice, and the Wizard of Oz is just so American. It's very Kansas. It's specifically tied to a time and place, and so I needed a voice that could emulate that time and place. I really, I feel terrible that this book has come out during this time. I've been talking to some other authors who've been seeing decreases in their Audible sales, and I've been seeing drops, and I think it's because there's far fewer people commuting, and commuting used to be the time that people were listening to audiobooks, or they would go to the gym and listen to an audiobook at the gym, and all the gyms are closed. And so I'm really hoping that there's going to be this audiobook come roaring back, and that this is just a temporary glitch. And I'm also saying this with a very small data pool of a couple of other authors saying, my audio sales have been falling for some reason. And it could be that we'll find out it was just us, and the overall trend is there's 10 times more audiobooks being sold.
Right. Yeah. This is such a weird time to see like what's increasing and what's decreasing in popularity. Like
some forms of entertainment are
skyrocketing.
Are skyrocketing or just demolished.
Oh yeah.
So podcasting is still on the climb.
Well, I worry about one of my primary sources of income was going to comic book and science fiction conventions, having a table, and just selling my work directly to the public. And it was a source of income that not as many authors pursue versus the ebook route, where my competition for ebooks is now like 1 million other people writing epic fantasy books. Whereas at a lot of these conventions, I'm one of 4 or 5 authors that might be writing in my genre. And it actually, it was a very, I got really good at pitching my book. I have a dragon puppet that I sit there and flap all weekend long. And so he's my spokes dragon. And it draws people to the table. People smile when they walk by. And it's like, hey, you like dragons? You like books about dragons? Come over, let's talk. And so all that revenue just vanished. So definitely the other thing is I would talk to people. One reason I might have had a drop in audio sales is I would talk to people, and they'd say, I don't really read books, I listen to them all on audio. And it's like, oh, that's great, I've got audiobooks here, let me sign you up for my newsletter, and I'll give you a free code for one of my books. And so I'd be building that base. So I feel like I'm I feel like it's going to be a long time before these big conventions ever start up again. I just can't imagine that there's going to be that many 80-year-old celebrities who, were movie stars, 30, 40 years ago, that 2,000 people will want to stand in line to get their signatures and shake their hands. I can't imagine those movie stars are going to want to come and shake hands with 2,000 people anymore. There's probably not enough money to get them. And if you don't have, William Shatner or someone, at these cons, are the fans going to come out? So
yeah.
It's one other thing I would definitely say that is important to know about being a writer. I want to make sure that I don't want this to come across as a complaint, but every 3 years, you're going to need to figure out a new way of making money at it. Because as soon as you figure out, I got into ebooks fairly early as an indie author, and was just like, gosh, look at me! I'm paying my mortgage every month with my superhero novels, and it's so great. And then it's like, gosh, there's 10,000 books an hour now being published, and the bumps I used to get, from being, having a high ranking, now those rankings are changing every 15 minutes. And you could get into a top 100 list and sit in there for 6 months. And now it's like, if I get to the top 100 and stay there for 6 days, I feel like it's an accomplishment. And so, it is something that a key to survival is never thinking that you know it all, and to always have a good network of peers who you're hearing from that are saying, yeah, this has stopped working, for me. And you're like, okay, so maybe it's time to refocus my efforts elsewhere. My real plan for getting through the COVID-19 is not to obsess about sales in any way whatsoever, but to use this time where I'm not traveling and not doing his appearances to write as many books as I possibly can, so that, when I do pick up again and have an opportunity to sell in person again, I've now got 25 books to sell versus 20 to sell, and hopefully it'll all be worth it in the long term. And that's I will promise to make this very short. That's the other important thing I have learned in doing 20 years of this. There have been time and time again where a publisher has folded, or my agent has quit, or a press went bankrupt and didn't pay me for my royalties. And, I think, it's over. It's like, it's not over. If you're alive and you can still type, every day can be a fresh start. And that might seem depressing that you have to keep starting over and over again, but you can't be fired. As long as you want to do this, you can do it. And there will always be new venues to get your words out to people. There are more ways of putting your books in front of people today than there were 10 years ago, and 10 years before that. And 10 years from now, there's going to be ways of putting your books in front of people that we can't even imagine. And as long as you are writing the books and paying attention to how to get them out there, you can be the first going into these opportunities, and there's always going to be a market for you if you believe in yourself and keep working at it.
That's fantastic advice.
Yeah.
Just basically not letting failure stop you from actually doing what you want to do, and have that fear of failure hang over you, because you are going to fail, and that's okay. and that idea of versatility and to keep going every day and start anew is quite a refreshing take on what is considered a long slog, but every day is quite
unlike a lot of other careers. You don't even have to worry that much about death. There's plenty of writers who get famous after they die. You're talking about the heart surgeon. For the most part, you die, your career as a heart surgeon is completely over. But, passing away, as an author, sometimes it's a really good career move.
Shakespeare.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah.
It's so true. And yeah, and like you said, James, I think that this is a wonderful conversation, and the thing that I've taken away is like success and the acclaim, the reputation, the self-satisfaction of getting your work out there and sharing your art and your passion is one thing, but there's still the dream, and there's still that process of and the journey of going through it. And Shalini and I are just kind of at the cusp or the beginning of it, and we already kind of feel that there's something to it. Like you said, it's not just a job, it's not just some like hobby, really. Like it's kind of a calling, and there's not really anything that can stop you from doing it if you really are committed to it and put your mind to it. And so I just want to thank you for sharing that message with us, with whoever's listening to our podcast. And I think that is just, it's awesome. We absolutely love to have you back on again, and there's a lot more we want to talk about. I want to talk about D&D more, and we do want to touch base with you on the new release and how that goes.
Yes.
And
Okay.
I did read.
This is the cover for the new release. Ignore the part about coming December 2019. I obviously blew that deadline, but that's what the cover looks like. Sorry if the lights in here are getting kind of dark.
No worries.
Yeah, no problem. And we're going to include links to all of the books and series that we've mentioned in the description of this episode, regardless of the platform that it's on. So with that, Mr. James Maxey, thank you very much for coming on to the High Fantasy Podcast, and we just want to wish you the best. Stay safe and healthy, and thanks.
Well, ask where social media is.
Yes, that's very true. Where can your fans find you online, and where can they purchase your fine books?
So on Facebook, I've got a fan group called DRAGONSGATE, and so it's called DRAGONSGATE, The World of James Maxey. So if you're on Facebook, finding me there is a really good place to be. There's several James Maxey on Facebook, so be careful about which ones you follow, because some of them are just lunatics. And I'm one of those lunatics, but I'm the one that will post pictures.
The one that we want.
Yeah.
I'm the one with the puppet. I'm also lackadaisically on Twitter at James Maxey, James-Maxey, something like that. You can find me. And I do have a website called jamesmaxey.net. And I promise that sometime before the end of this month, I'm actually going to update it. I don't think I've updated it in close to 18 months now. And so I really need to possibly mention some of the new releases that I've got out. So I'm looking forward to being finished with this book so I can actually do the other stuff that's involved in being a writer.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, and take care.
Check out the description of this video and you can see the different platforms we put our content on, as well as our social media links. Thanks again, and see you next time.